Hello everyone, welcome to my new video. It's been a long time since my last upload, but I've got some new hardware to test and I've prepared a bunch of new tests for today. In this video I'm testing AMD Athlon II X4 845 CPU, a quad-core processor of Carat-So architecture that was originally intended for mobile platforms, but later adapted for desktops in a form of this CPU. Today I'm testing this CPU in 3 different variations, with stock frequency of 3.5 GHz without turbo, with 3.8 GHz turbo frequency and with overclock to 4.1 GHz. Firstly I'll show some synthetic tests and then we'll go to see some gaming benchmarks. So, let's begin. First test was Passmark CPU test. At 3.5 GHz the score was 5,164 points for all cores and 1,496 for single core. Enabling turbo-upped multi-core score to 5,421 points and single core score to 1,606. Overclocking the Athlon to 4.1 GHz upped the scores to 5,911 and 1735 for multi-core and single core, respectively. That's 9% increase in multi-core performance and 8% improvement for single thread. Next one is Geekbench test. Without turbo the score was 6,488 points. With turbo enabled, the score went to 7,353 points and overclocking added additional 6.33% of performance with the overclocked score of 7,819. Another test was Cinebench 11.5. Without turbo at 3.5 GHz multi-core score was 3.35 points and 0.98 for single core. At turbo frequency of 3.8 GHz multi-core score got to 3.64 points and single thread upped to 1.05. Overclock to 4.1 GHz yielded 8.2% gain in multi-core score and it got to 3.94 points. Single-threaded score got up to 1.14 points and that's 8.6% increase. It was a similar story in Cinebench 15. Without turbo multi-core score was 277 and single-thread score was 83 points. When turbo was enabled, the scores got to 299 and 89 for multi-thread and single-thread scores, respectively. Overclocking gave multi-thread a score of 8.4% lift to 324 points. Single-thread score got to 97 points, a 9% improvement. Now it's time for gaming benchmarks. First game was Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a fast-paced online shooter. Lowest settings at resolution of 720p was used. With turbo disabled, 0.1% low was 27 FPS, 1% low was 52 and an average was 102 frames per second. Enabling turbo interestingly lowered performance, albeit not significantly much. 0.1% lows dropped to 18, 1% low and average frame rates lost 2 FPS, dropping to 50 and 100 frames per second, respectively. Overclocking yielded a slight increase in performance. 0.1% got to 31 FPS, 1% got to 60 FPS and average frame rate increased by 11 frames per second, an 11% increase in performance. Next game is Dirt 3. The story is similar with this game, also. Lowest settings at 640 by 480 resolution was used. With no turbo, 0.1% low was 73 FPS, 1% low was 83 FPS, and average frame rate was 116 frames per second. Enabling turbo lowered performance. 0.1% lows dropped to 55 FPS, 1% low got to 82 and the average stayed at the same 116 frames per second. Overclocking the Athlon to 4.1 GHz gave a slight boost to performance. 0.1% and 1% lows increased to 84 and 94 frames per second, respectively. And the average got a 13% or 15 FPS boost to a total of 131 frames per second. Another game is NBA 2K18. And the performance in this game fluctuated significantly less than in other two games I've already tested. 0.1% low frame rate stayed the same throughout my testing. With 3.5 GHz, 3.8 GHz and 4.1 GHz, 0.1% low stayed at the same frame rate of 20 frames per second. Without turbo, 1% lows was 78 FPS and average was 107 frames per second. Enabling turbo dropped down 1% lows to 70 FPS, although average frame rate increased by 1 frame per second to 108 FPS. Overclocking the CPU increased 1% lows by 1 FPS and an average by 6 FPS. Last game is Sniper Elite 3. This game received the least impact with overclocking. CPU clocks did not impact average frame rate. Either with 3.5 GHz, 3.8 GHz and 4.1 GHz average was 86 FPS. 0.1% lows did change, although increasing frequency gave an opposite result. These low values dropped significantly. While difference between 3.5 GHz and 3.8 GHz was negligible as 0.1% lows stayed at 48 and 49 frames per second respectively, overclocking the CPU to 4.1 GHz harvested this value to 36 frames per second. That's 26.5% decrease in performance. 1% lows was also left barely affected and varied only within a couple of frames. In conclusion, I could say that this CPU is a rather mediocre one, although for its price of $60 to $70 it is a decent budget solution for basic computing. This processor is also fairly good for basic video editing. This video by the way was rendered with this Athlon II. Gaming experience also wasn't all that bad and, paired with my overclocked NVIDIA GT 730, it showed some decent numbers in today's testing. So that will be it for this video. Thank you for watching and I hope you liked it.